Today, we're going to take a look at an important question. Why does Satan still exist? Why didn't God just destroy him? To answer that question, I need to tell you a story, and if you stick around to hear it, it has the potential to transform your thinking. The year was 1965, and the day was March 7th. This was a day that would be etched in American history. It was a day that was a turning point in the United States. And it's a day that can help you and I understand this question of why Satan still exists and why you might still be choosing Satan over God. So what was it that happened on this day? On March 7th, 1965, a then 25-year-old civil rights activist, John Lewis, led over 600 peaceful protesters in a march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And I want you to keep that word in mind, peaceful, because it's going to help us later to understand the war between Satan and God called the Great Controversy. But for now, back to the story. The march was organized to peacefully protest the lack of voting rights of African Americans, among other injustices. The hope was that they would be able to bring attention to these issues. This is a clip from the movie Selma that highlights the planning leading up to that day. And I want to see if you can notice the most important thing as it relates to the planning of the march.
Don't fight back. It's a nonviolent movement. Nonviolence is not passive. It's actually very strong.
You shouldn't do this, John.
Don't respond, don't resist. That was the mantra that was drilled into the minds of the protesters. And the reason for this was because under the guidance of Martin Luther King and many others connected with this movement, they realized that it was imperative that people see something. And I don't want you to forget this because it will be so crucial to understand in regards to the great controversy between Christ and Satan and the reason that Satan still exists. It's one word, and that word is contrast. America had to see the contrast. They knew that in order to truly bring about change, ideas would have to change, opinions would have to change, and most importantly, hearts would have to change. And why was that? You see, for hundreds of years, the minds of the people were conditioned to indifference. They had grown accustomed to seeing the sufferings of other human beings that didn't look like them. They had grown accustomed to seeing injustice all around, and so the pleas of justice went largely unheard. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the Bible speaks of this world as a sort of theater by stating that we are a spectacle to men and to angels. The universe is watching this earth to see how the great controversy is going to play out. They're looking to see how it's all going to come to an end. And up until now, Christ has not returned because the controversy is not completely settled yet. And I believe it's because you and I need to see the contrast. Now, back to our story. The day came. The protesters gathered and began their march undisturbed through the streets of Selma. The anxiety was building. What were they walking into? Would all of them make it out of this alive? As they reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, it became evident that this peaceful protest would not have a peaceful response. Anti-protesters were there. The police were there. And then the words rang out over a bullhorn.
This is an unlawful assembly. You have 2 minutes to disperse. Go home or go to your church. This march will not continue.
What followed these words was horrific. The police officers rushed the unarmed protesters, men and women alike. They proceeded to fire tear gas. They beat some with sticks, while others were punched and kicked. And I'll spare you having to see the gory details. Now, what I'm about to say might seem a little strange, but this moment, while horrific, I would argue, was absolutely necessary. And it's because that day people saw something, and that thing was the contrast. The contrast between right and wrong, and more importantly, the contrast between good and evil. A similar contrast took place in April of 31 AD. That was the day that Jesus was crucified, and on that day something happened that changed ideas, it changed opinions, and most importantly, it changed hearts. But not just here on earth. It also changed hearts in heaven as the door became completely closed to Satan. Because it was on that day that the universe was able to see the contrast between the principles of God and the principles of Lucifer. You see, up until this point, for thousands of years, Lucifer had some type of access to the angelic host and the beings of other worlds, as it's presented in the book of Job, chapter 1 and 2, that when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, that Satan came also among them. That's right. God didn't cancel Satan. To the contrary, he allowed Satan to continue his smear campaign against God. He allowed Satan to say whatever he wanted in the presence of the sons of God. This was the great controversy on full display, as God in his wisdom knew that the only way to ultimately defeat Satan would be to allow him time to develop the principles of his government and wait for the perfect time for the universe to see the contrast in its entirety. And to help you understand this, I want to go back to that day in Selma, Alabama. As I already said, those protesters were told not to respond, no matter what. The news cameras were there that day to capture the events that took place, and millions of Americans watched in horror as they saw the threats, the tear gas, and the beatings. But most importantly, they saw the contrast. They saw the true nature of discrimination. They saw the true nature of racism. They saw the true nature of the unrenewed human heart, and they recoiled from the images that they were seeing on their screens. This defining moment did more to push the civil rights movement forward than any speech or legislation, because the picture became clear. Segregation and discrimination are not something that can be ignored, but rather these principles were a scourge to society that needed to be dealt with head on if there was any hope to have a society built on equity and justice. Jesus understood the need for the universe to see the contrast so that his government could be safe from sin for eternity. He understood that the questions about the character of God could only be settled if the seeds of good and evil could fully ripen, so that people could truly see the contrast, so that they could truly see the cost of sin. God understands that the only way to defeat and destroy Satan is by convincing us that he has nothing good to offer us, and that sin only leads to misery and death. He said as much in John chapter 12, when he spoke these words, "Now is the judgment of this world. Now shall the prince of the world be cast out. And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to me." John inserts his comment after Christ's words and says, "This he said, signifying what death he should die." Jesus, of course, was looking to the cross. He understood that humanity and the rest of the universe were about to see the seeds of Lucifer's rebellion bear its fruit, as Satan was about to get his hands on Jesus. And it's deeper than that if you understand who Jesus is, because Satan was about to get his hands on God, the very God that had created him. Satan had been salivating to have this opportunity for thousands of years, and when the moment arrived, working through men that were under his control, he mocked Jesus. He struck Jesus. He pulled out his beard. He jammed a crown of thorns in his head. He whipped him until his back was raw. He forced him to carry the weight of a cross when human strength was failing. He stripped Jesus naked. He drove nails through his hands and feet. He slammed the cross into the ground, and he laughed and cheered as he hung on the cross in full humiliation. And finally, after Jesus had died, he violated his dead body by shoving a spear in his side. And while all this was happening, Christ did not resist. He did not retaliate. He did not curse Satan. All that he did was remain obedient until his death, even the death of the cross. And all I can say is, what a contrast. So, the question begs to be answered. With all of the suffering and death that Satan has instigated for thousands of years, shouldn't he have already been exposed for who he is? Why the need for that moment of Jesus on the cross? I want you to take a look at this quote from The Desire of Ages. It says, "Satan saw that his disguise was torn away. His administration was laid open before the unfallen angels and before the heavenly universe. He had revealed himself as a murderer. By shedding the blood of the Son of God, he had uprooted himself from the sympathies of the heavenly beings. Henceforth, his work was restricted. Whatever attitude he might assume, he could no longer await the angels as they came from the heavenly courts, and before them accuse Christ's brethren of being clothed with the garments of blackness and the defilement of sin. The last link of sympathy between Satan and the heavenly world was broken." I hope you're seeing what's being presented. Up until this moment, there was still some sympathy between Satan and the heavenly angels. Up until this time that Jesus died on the cross, Satan was able to wait at the gates of the heavenly courts as the angels passed in and out, spewing his slander and accusations. But when the angels saw what they saw that day, the last link of sympathy between Satan and the heavenly world was broken. And as Christ said in John chapter 12, Satan was cast out that day because the angels no longer wanted anything to do with him. They didn't want to hear what he had to say at all. But get this, obviously, Satan has still not been destroyed yet, and we need to understand why. And to understand why, let's go back to the Desire of Ages to see a short yet powerful statement. It says, "Yet Satan was not then destroyed." The angels did not even then understand all that was involved in the great controversy. The principles at stake were to be more fully revealed, and for the sake of man, Satan's existence must be continued. Man as well as angels must see, and look at that word, the contrast between the Prince of Light and the Prince of Darkness. He must choose whom he will serve. What a statement. Even though the sympathies of the angels were removed in April of 31 AD, still did not fully understand the principles of Satan's government. They still needed to be more fully revealed. And the most shocking statement is that for the sake of man, Satan's existence needed to be continued. What? How could Satan's continued existence be for the good of humanity? Much like what took place in Selma, after people had seen the evils of slavery, racism, and Jim Crow laws for hundreds of years, it took something momentous for them to really get it. Because as humans, we sometimes have a way of justifying evil in our minds. We get accustomed to seeing evil, and it can cause us to become indifferent and indecisive. It's no different when it comes to our understanding of sin. In order to truly part ways with sin, we must come to understand the contrast between Christ and Satan. We must see the purity, righteousness, humility, and love of God in its fullness, and in contrast, we must come to see the filthiness, unrighteousness, pride, and hatred of Satan. And so today, I'm asking you to take a look at the cross. I'm asking you to see the difference between Christ and Satan, and to make your choice whose side you're on. In the beginning of this video, I asked the question, why didn't God destroy Satan? And the answer is that God is waiting for you and I to fully part ways with him, so that once and for all, the principles of Satan's government can be fully rejected in our hearts, never to rise again. And it will be at that time that Satan can finally be destroyed. The choice today is mine, and the choice today is yours. What choice will you make? God bless.